I should say that I'm not a philosopher or a teacher of critical thinking, so I've been pleased by the emphasis so far on context and concrete examples, because that's all I've got for you. Mind you, you should always be particularly suspicious of the person who claims he has no theory. So maybe I do have a theory and you can tell me what it is afterwards. I was watching Tony Blair give his evidence to the Chilcot inquiry in January. And I was struck anew by the way he talks about it. And when he talks about joining in the war, he says, I removed Saddam Hussein. It's always been this word remove with him, I removed him. And during the Chilcot inquiry evidence, he used a version of this word 14 times. It was remove, removed, removal, removing. In his very last answer, he still was clinging to this word, saying that he felt responsibility, but not a regret, for removing Saddam Hussein. Removed. It's an interesting word to use because it's precise and fastidious. It almost makes you think of a giant hand, perhaps wearing a surgical glove, reaching down from the sky and just plucking Saddam Hussein out of one of his palaces. A very antiseptic operation. Of course, what really happened was that a whole country was invaded, there was a lot of bombing and shooting and so forth, and very many people, including a large number of civilians, died. So you might almost start to suspect that talking about the war in terms of removing one person is a verbal strategy designed to make us forget about the reality of that war. Of course, that war was part of the larger war on terror. And that was a clever slogan, because if you say that Al-Qaeda's weapon was terror, and also that Saddam Hussein ran a terror state, then the two things seem to be related, and invading Iraq must have something to do with fighting Osama bin Laden. Subsequently, Israel's war in Lebanon in 2006 could be looked on indulgently by everyone because it was part of the war on terror as well. And aggressive posturing against Iran could be justified on the basis that that country was a sponsor of terror. So this one phrase, war on terror, and the associated terror vocabulary could justify just about any war you felt like waging. For a while, actually, in the summer of 2005, America tried a rebranding exercise. Instead of the war on terror, they said, it was going to be the global struggle against violent extremism. Well, what is extremism? It's an opinion that's very different from yours. Extremism is an even more flexible word than terror because it multiplies your possible enemies. And according to the British police now, in this country, if you take part in political struggles or non-violent protests, you are now part of the phenomenon of what they call domestic extremism. And so via this label, domestic extremists, non-violent protesters are semantically associated in the law enforcement mind with those who commit acts of mass civilian murder. And they are also associated departmentally because the police platoons who are tasked with hunting down domestic extremists are run by the Terrorism and Allied Matters Committee of the Association of Chief Police Officers. The language of terror justifies not only wars, but the treatment of individuals against whom no case has been proven. Arguments about detention without trial, or rather, as we should say, imprisonment without trial, were conducting on the basis that we had to do something about a class of people called terrorist suspects. This phrase began to be regularly used in official White House news releases since September the 11th, 2001, and it appears in the UK's Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act of December 2001. And it's a phrase that I still hear on the radio today, and I wince every time I hear it. Well, why? What's wrong with calling someone a terrorist suspect? It's easy to see if you substitute the alleged crime. If you call someone who hasn't yet been convicted of any offence a rapist suspect, or a murderer suspect, you're already assuming the guilt of the person in question, because you're attaching to them the descriptive label reserved for a murderer or a rapist, i.e. someone whose crime has been proven in court. So in the same way, to use the phrase terrorist suspect commits a preemptive essentialism. The person is first defined as a terrorist, and only then is it grudgingly acknowledged that the basis for such a categorization is as yet untested. This assumption of guilt obviously makes it more comfortable to order torture and indefinite imprisonment without trial, or to export victims to regimes where it's known they're going to be tortured. Terrorist suspects can easily come to mean, in the public mind, just terrorists. And it's not as though there are not more accurate descriptions available. You could say suspected terrorist, or you could say terrorism suspect rather than terrorist suspect, or you could even say terror suspect. They don't carry quite the same prejudice or charge. So these phrases are built around the concept of terror, the war on terror, terrorist suspect. These are names for things, but they're not neutral names. They're names that are trying to persuade us of something. War on terror is trying to persuade us that it's a good idea to have a war against a country in order to combat terrorism. Terrorist suspect persuades us that someone not convicted of any crime deserves everything he gets. And so these kinds of persuasive names are what I call Unspeak. Now, this is not a new idea. Michael was talking just before lunch about the term persuasive definition, and Quentin Skinner has used the phrase evaluative descriptive terms, which is accurate but a bit of a mouthful, so I prefer to call it Unspeak. And of course, worries about the politicization of names go all the way back, as we know, to Confucius and Cicero. But the reason I like to call it Unspeak is because I think it gets at a particular feature of my examples in that they are trying to smuggle in an argument about something, an unspoken argument, by packing a viewpoint into the description right at the start. That way you frame the debate instantly on your own terms and you avoid the obligation to explicitly argue your assumptions. At the same time, you unspeak in the sense of silencing or erasing opposing points of view. And we can see this particularly clearly in the issue of abortion that Don was talking about yesterday. In America in the 70s, anti-abortionists had originally defined their position as defending a right to life. People who thought that abortion should be legal in some cases then rhetorically softened their own preference by inventing the slogan pro-choice, focusing their argument on a woman's autonomy. And their opponents rapidly responded with a new slogan, pro-life. Well, who would say they were against life? And surely life is more important than mere choice, which sounds like you're just choosing something in a supermarket. But my point is that in this debate, neither side was really being honest about what its position was. Not the people who called themselves pro-life and not the people who called themselves pro-choice. And the fact that they weren't being honest about what they were trying to argue is part of the reason why it became, and is now, extremely difficult to have a reasoned debate on the issue of abortion in America. And we can also think about the issue of tax in terms of Unspeak. People on the left generally refer to tax cuts, while people on the right generally refer to tax relief. Well, if you're relieved from something, it must be a bad thing. You're relieved from an illness or a burden. So immediately, if you talk about tax relief, you're saying that tax is bad and should be minimized wherever possible. There is even disagreement over what to call a tax haven, as I discovered quite recently. Because if you think about it, the way the phrase tax haven operates is a bit mysterious, because it's not a place where you send your tax to be safe. It's a sort of money haven, where you send your money and no one can extract the taxes you'd rather not pay. So you might prefer to say that people using a tax haven are financial asylum seekers. Haven, the word haven means refuge or sanctuary. So arguably, politicians who are campaigning for more regulation of tax havens are harming their cause by accepting the frame of the phrase tax haven. Mounting an attack on a haven sounds rather bullying and perfidious. And so there are some people who are suggesting that we should replace the phrase tax haven with the phrase secrecy jurisdiction. Well, who are the people suggesting that? They are a campaigning think tank called the Tax Justice Network. Well, who's against tax justice? We all like tax justice. So their name itself is already Unspeak, just as if you disagree with Friends of the Earth, you must be an enemy of the whole planet. In Britain, the insurgent Conservative Party at the moment has been closely studying this kind of language on tax. There's a notorious pollster for the Republican Party called Frank Luntz, and he is credited, or has credited himself, with inventing the term death tax to describe inheritance taxes in America. And David Cameron and George Osborne have gratefully appropriated this phrase, so now they describe it as a death tax, the idea of making a levy on estates of the deceased to pay for care for the elderly. Now, strictly speaking, once you're dead, you can't be taxed because you no longer own anything. But death tax is a clever piece of Unspeak because it plugs into a wry narrative about how tax is increasingly spent on anything and everything, short only so far of the air we breathe. Cameron and Osborne have also had rhetorical help recently in the election campaign from a gang of people whom you might want to call, depending on your point of view, either business leaders or captains of industry or self-interested plutocrats. Many of them have lined up in the last few weeks behind the Conservatives to denounce the proposed 1% rise in national insurance contributions as a tax on jobs. Well, yes, in a sense, this is a tax on jobs, but only in exactly the same sense that all taxes can be described as taxes on things we like. So if employer national insurance is a tax on jobs, sure, but VAT is a tax on shopping, and income tax is a tax on work, and fuel duty is a tax on getting to work, and alcohol duty is a tax on relaxing in the pub, trying to forget about your work. Nonetheless, it's obviously useful to the captains of industry, or the self-interested plutocrats, to call a proposed hike in their contributions a tax on jobs, even though economists have pointed out that what happens when you increase employer national insurance contributions is not that they sack people or hire few people, they just pass the cost on to employees so that employees' wages rise less fast than they otherwise would. We're also meant to be scared into believing that increasing taxes might lead to job losses, but job losses itself is a form of Unspeak. Since the financial crisis began, we've heard a lot of reports about thousands of jobs have been lost. It seems very careless. Who is losing these jobs and why aren't they looking after them more carefully? But what the passive voice and the accidental connotation of loss are doing here is unspeaking in the sense of trying to make us forget about the particular agency involved. What is really happening is either companies are going bust or companies are deliberately choosing to fire workers. So we see there's an inherent asymmetry in the usual language used to describe relations between employers and employees. On the one hand, the captains of industry, or the self-interested plutocrats, are the first to claim the credit, when they hire people, for job creation. When, on the other hand, they sack people, we do not hear reports in the media of widespread job destruction. Instead, we meekly accept that jobs are merely being lost, perhaps down the back of the sofa. Now, some terms of Unspeak have to be replaced with new ones as they lose their power to obscure uncomfortable truths. And so we see what some people have called a euphemism treadmill. One simple example is that in the Vietnam War, US soldiers who had died were brought back in body bags. For the first Gulf War, body bags became human remains pouches. And for the 2003 war in Iraq, they had turned into the completely antiseptic transfer tubes. The same kind of euphemism treadmill has operated in the description of financial disaster, as J.K. Galbraith noted long ago. He said, even the word depression itself, Galbraith wrote, was the terminological product of an effort to soften the connotation of deep trouble. In the 19th century, the term crisis was normally employed. With time, however, this acquired the connotation of the misfortune it described. And now, of course, instead of depression, we say recession, because depression itself was eventually thought to be too depressing. And yet, recession now is frightening to people. It already was back in 1978, when Alfred Kahn, who was an economist for the Carter administration, was told by White House press aides that he had to stop using the word recession because it was too negative. And Kahn's response was to give speeches where he would start off by announcing, "We're in danger of seeing the worst banana in 45 years." Arguably, it's made more difficult to conduct reasoned arguments about economic affairs in general, because so much of our ordinary language is infected by metaphors and assumptions from commerce, to the extent that we often don't even notice it. We might casually speak of an agreement as a deal, or talk of the payoff of an argument or a work of art, or speak of cashing in an argument or an idea. And a certain moral attitude to money is also built into the way we talk about it. To take a simple example, we say in English that we earn such and such an amount per year. Well, if we earn it, we must somehow deserve it. In the same way, a person who has $1 million might be tempted to say that he's worth $1 million. And an executive who is paid millions per year might refer to this money as his compensation. They're doing a terribly unpleasant job after all. They really should be compensated. I was struck by this when I noticed that it's not quite the same in other languages. Well, the other language I speak is French. And in French, if you want to speak about how much money you earn, you say je gagne in tel song, gagner, which means to win, as in a competition or a lottery. So there's not so much of a notion of inherent moral desert built into the language. And the language of commerce, this is something Michael noted rapidly, is itself infected by military metaphors. Captains of industry itself is a military metaphor. And we can also speak of waging strategic campaigns and targeting consumers, of launching products, of doing hostile takeovers, of having price wars, and of course of firing employees. And at the same time, war itself may be framed as just another species of business, servicing targets, delivering propaganda products or force packages, paying a price that is worth paying. So Unspeak is very useful when you want to blur the line between war and peace, and also when you want to erect a false distinction between good guys and bad guys. Here's an old favourite that you'll all remember: weapons of mass destruction. The war in Iraq, we were told at the time, was necessary because of the threat of weapons of mass destruction. Paul Wolfowitz explained that they had settled on that notion because, well, for bureaucratic reasons. It was the one thing everything could agree on. Condoleezza Rice said, "We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud," and so implied that nuclear Armageddon would be the price of inaction. And much speculation surrounded possible chemical and biological weapons. Wrapping all this up in the mantra weapons of mass destruction enabled everyone to just forget about the details and the differences between various weapons and simply trust that Saddam Hussein had amassed the most terrible arsenal known to man. Weapons of mass destruction, we were supposed to believe, were worse in a qualitative way than other weapons. But the apocalyptic tone was matched by deliberate vagueness, the kind of useful deliberate vagueness that you often find in Unspeak. After all, how much destruction was mass destruction? No one was actually saying. Weapons of mass destruction lumps nuclear weapons together with chemical and biological weapons. But the kinds of chemical and biological weapons that have so far been employed in human warfare don't compare with the devastation of a single nuke. And no one was seriously claiming that Saddam actually had nukes at the time, rather than he had somehow been seeking them. Chemical and biological weapons are much less destructive too than many other kinds of weapons used by our side, such as the American MOAB, which stands for a Massive Ordnance Air Blast. That is the replacement for an old superbomb that was known as the Daisy Cutter, which wasn't a gardening tool, but contains over 18,000 pounds of high explosive, kills everyone within a mile and a half, breaks windows up to 5 miles away, and creates a mushroom cloud 10,000 feet high. By contrast, the nerve gas attack on the Tokyo subway by the Aum cult in 1995 killed 12 people. So which one is the weapon of mass destruction? Some people are already worried that now that weapons of mass destruction has lost its frightening power, and that it might be time to ratchet on to the next item in what we might want to christen the dysphemism treadmill. The Daily Mail columnist Melanie Phillips came up with a striking candidate recently when she said that Iran was busy building a genocide bomb. What is a genocide bomb? Is it a bomb that is able to kill only members of one ethnic group, howsoever defined, leaving everyone else unharmed? How does that work? Well, actually, of course, we know that genocide can be committed using any kind of bomb. And if you don't have a bomb, you can commit genocide using poison gas or rifles or machetes. Now, Iran, if you believe reports, is seeking to build a nuclear bomb, i.e. exactly the same kind of nuclear weapon that lots of other countries have. So if an Iranian nuke is a genocide bomb, then surely so is a French nuke or a British nuke. The real difference, of course, is that our weapons are tools of defense that we use only with a heavy heart, whereas our enemies' weapons are inherently criminal, even before they've ever been used. So Unspeak is used to make official enemies sound as depraved and terrifying as possible. And at the same time, it can be used to obscure the truth about our own crimes. For example, the American torture of prisoners in Abu Ghraib and Bagram and elsewhere was the subject of a desperate semantic campaign by lawyers in the administration and politicians denying that the torture was in fact torture. They would concede only in the face of irrefutable evidence that some abuse might have occurred, perhaps as the result of just a few bad apples. To the extent that the media reported these revelations in the official language of abuse and was very slow to come out and say torture, the media itself was complicit in the campaign to obfuscate the truth of an explicitly, officially sanctioned program of torture. And the media is also complicit, in my view, for having continued to use the official term waterboarding for a practice that in fact involves forced drowning of the victim that stops, ideally, just before death. The word waterboarding, in contrast with this reality, sounds like a beach sport, or at worst, just a bit of rough and tumble. Surely only a wuss would object to having a bit of water splashed on him. And so the willing, unquestioning use of this euphemism, waterboarding, tends to corrupt the public argument about torture. As with war in general, torture perverts language. Torture has been called the repetitive administration of legitimate force, which sounds like a tedious day at the office, or sensitive questioning conducted by experts, as though it were a caring therapy session. The prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, said Dick Cheney, had nothing to complain about, because after all they were living in the tropics. So, I've given you a few examples of Unspeak: removing Saddam Hussein, terrorist suspects, tax on jobs, weapons of mass destruction, waterboarding. They're all trying to persuade us by stealth of a very particular point of view in each case. Now it's time for me to concede that there are two dangers about the kind of argument about language that I'm making. The first danger would lie in assuming that there could ever be a completely neutral language, somehow metaphorically transparent like a window pane. This is impossible. Every word arrives at our ears with a cloud of associations and emotional import. There is really no perfectly unframed or unrhetorical way of talking about the world. And there never was any golden age of political debate without propaganda, and nor could there ever be. Nevertheless, those things having been conceded, I think we still can tell the difference, and it's an important difference, a moral difference, between language that states its position directly, even if we consider this position to be couched in blatantly propagandistic terms, in contrast to language that is trying to pull a fast one and to close down debate before it even starts. The second danger, in my kind of argument, would lie in its potential to sound condescending to ordinary people. You would be condescending if you assumed that Unspeak is always and everywhere successful, that it always succeeds in pulling the wool over people's eyes, and is an efficient tool of brainwashing, something that only a few heroic critics, such as myself, are able to see through. Well, I don't believe that either. If we pay sufficient attention, we can always see through it. And this point, I think, was put best by Victor Klemperer, who is the writer who wrote Language of the Third Reich, who kept notebooks during the 30s of how the Nazis were, of all the new official phrases that the Nazis were coming up with that he considered to be abuses of the German language in service of their ideology. And Klemperer writes, "Whatever it is that people are determined to hide, be it only from others or from themselves, even things they carry around unconsciously, language reveals all. What a man says may be a pack of lies, but his true self is laid bare for all to see in the style of his utterance." And we can apply Klemperer's lesson once again to the present election campaign. One of the terms being bandied about by both sides is aspiration. As against the actual catastrophe of the present for many people, because so many jobs have been lost, what all the politicians wish to preserve is an unreasoning optimism about the future, which is captured in their use of the word aspiration. So Gordon Brown talks of an age of aspiration and analyses his citizens like this: He says, "This is a country of aspirational individuals who, given half a chance, want to get on and not simply get by." Meanwhile, David Cameron says, "Change must be based on the values of responsibility and aspiration. We can't go on with an old-fashioned left-wing class war on aspiration." Well, politically, this fetishization of aspiration encourages social and economic anxiety in the people. It insists that a neurotic obsession with climbing the greasy pole is a national virtue. But at the same time, it cunningly reverses the usual manifesto structure whereby the politician promises something to the people. In this case, it's enough that the people promise something to themselves, that they aspire to something. And in the meantime, the politician can look on benevolently and encourage them in their lust for material advancement. The people, therefore, are praised inasmuch as they merely continue to desire something that is kept critically vague. And the politician doesn't have to promise that he will grant them the means to fulfill those aspirations. Indeed, he doesn't have to promise anything at all. Which is just as well, since in the world of fashion, where aspirational products are things like £1,000 handbags that are deliberately designed to be not attainable to everyone, aspirational is, in politics as in fashion, it becomes a key term of envy, of wanting what others have and you can't have. So this is, in quite a precise sense, the politics of envy in the current election campaign. I was struck in Michael's talk just before lunch by his notion of intellectual and moral self-defense. And I think anyone can and ought to criticize public language in the way I've given a few examples of doing today. We all have the capability and the duty as citizens, I think, to interrogate public language in order to uncover the unspoken arguments that are being fed to us, in order to see whether they can really survive in the light of reason. Thank you.
No speech that persuades by stealth. So as with some of the questions that we've heard, one of my concerns is that I'm concerned that this definition is too expansive, that there's a risk that if taken literally, it would abolish metaphor and various other things besides. I was slightly reminded in thinking about this of a famous incident in the history of philosophy, which some of you may be aware of, that John Locke has this famous denunciation of metaphor, but Paul de Man, the great deconstructionist critic, pointed out that in the very heart of this attack that Locke makes on metaphor, Locke calls metaphors monsters and chimeras, and de Man thought that this was a little unfortunate and ironic. So if we turn to the handouts, the first couple of things on the handouts are from the start of Stephen's book. So item 1 on the handout, I'll read it out. Each of these terms, pro-life, tax relief, friends of the earth, is a name for something but not a neutral name. It's a name that smuggles in a political opinion. And this is done in a remarkably efficient way, a whole partisan argument packed into a soundbite. That's even briefer than a soundbite, it's just a word or a term. These precision-engineered packages of language are launched by politicians and campaigners and targeted at newspaper headlines and snazzy television graphics, where they land and dispense their payload of persuasion into public consciousness. So you can see what I'm doing there, right? I'm drawing attention to the metaphors that are embedded in that passage, which are basically, one might say, smuggling in the thought that Unspeak is like a weapon, that words are weapons. Well, are words weapons? Well, yes and no, I guess is the answer to that. We might say that words aren't weapons, they're just words. Words don't kill people. People who use words kill people, but many of you will recognise that as a transliteration of a famous slogan used by the National Rifle Association of America. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. To which my response has always been, yes, but they most often do it with guns. So I'm not sure where exactly that leaves us, but I think one place that it leaves us is with the thought that we have to be cautious not to overplay the extent to which A, it's possible not to speak unspeak, and B, it's desirable not to speak unspeak. And that's the point that I want to emphasize in quite a lot of my remarks to follow, that I'm concerned that sometimes Stephen suggests that this kind of talk, this kind of way of using language is always necessarily undesirable, at least to the extent that we should minimize it as much as possible. And I'm not sure that's true. And I'll try and support that thought in the next few minutes. So let me turn to another passage from the early part of Unspeak, which is not on your handout, where Stephen makes this absolutely explicit. He says, what we should be doing in trying to get beyond Unspeak or defeat Unspeak is, quote, establish the restoration of more neutral language. And I want to query what is involved in this idea of neutrality. And as I say, I want to suggest that actually we shouldn't try to be as neutral as possible. Being a Wittgensteinian, yes, I'm very attracted by the idea that we ought, in some sense, always to base ourselves in or return to what Wittgenstein calls ordinary language or everyday language. But language has to be used well, it has to be used appropriately. Sometimes it ought to be used powerfully, including to rouse, creatively. Stephen quotes Cicero, also on page 11, as saying this: it will be desirable to invalidate the definition of the adversaries, but that will be invalidated if it be proved to be false. This proof must be deduced from the belief of men concerning it. When we consider in what manner and under what circumstances, and that's the question of use, men are accustomed to use that expression in their ordinary writing or talking. And Stephen comments, insofar as this book has a method, that is it. And I think that's splendid and very close to ordinary language philosophy indeed. But I think we also ought also to remember that Cicero was himself a great rhetorician and speaker, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. And it seems to me that that is unavoidable. I'm concerned that there is a potential danger of conservatism if we put ourselves in the position of suggesting that we always ought to speak as neutrally as possible, because what appears to be neutral will always be closer to the status quo than to any proposed radical alternative. Some of Stephen's own thinking, as those of you who read the book will know, is quite radical in the sense that he suggests that actually a lot of the ways in which we have become accustomed to speaking, for example, about nature, need to be ploughed over and overcome. But that, I think, stands in some tension with the thought that we always ought to speak as neutrally as possible, because a lot of the time, people will defend the existing way of speaking about nature precisely by claiming that it is more neutral than proposed novel alternatives, and I'll give some examples in a minute. Stephen talks about calling things by their true names rather than by unspeak. And I think that's absolutely right. But once again, I want to raise a query. Does that mean as emotionlessly as possible, or without any evaluative or normative commitments? And I worry here slightly that there's some kind of idea of our normal state being one of being emotionless information processes in the kind of way that perhaps at times Descartes imagined. And let me draw your attention here to quote 3 on the handout, which is from a wonderful book by George Marcus called The Sentimental Citizen. The idea of being sentimental, this term is taken on quite negative connotations for us in the present day. This is perhaps itself a reason to be concerned. And this is what Marcus says: the critical roles that emotional processes play suggest what a fully rational cerebral electorate would look like. First, absent enthusiasm would be largely passive and inactive. It would be an electorate disinclined to do much of anything. Second, absent anxiety, it would be simply unmoved by crisis or challenge, moral or material. Though many grievances might warrant public attention and engagement, even the most strenuous efforts to engage the public would find citizens largely unresponsive. Too confident that all is well, that all cries for redress were overdone, alarmist, and merited at best a wait-and-see attitude. Again, the danger of a kind of excessive conservatism there. My thought here is that there is a danger that a unstintingly anti-unspeak attitude risks worsening our situation if it would recommend to us that we ought to describe the situation that we are in as rational and unemotional terms as possible, when that situation is a particularly bad kind of situation, such as the situation that I think we are actually in the world today. And I actually think that the description that Marcus gives here is remarkably like the situation that we actually face. I think that appeals to emotion and to deep values are in fact extremely difficult to make in our present day political world. It's very difficult for us to say some of the things that I think we ought to be saying. For example, that love is good, that we ought to love and care for one another. When politicians try to say these kinds of things, they get laughed at, basically. What about that this earth is good, that life is good? The kind of things that, for example, Philip Pullman tries to say in his great trilogy, His Dark Materials, but again, it's very difficult to state in the form of political discourse. Some green political discourse is almost a cry of kind of pain and disbelief at the appalling situation that we've got ourselves into and how complacent we are with regard to it. But this is very difficult to do in a way that doesn't involve any of the kind of non-neutral language that can be criticised as unspeak. So, the danger, I think, of a single-minded and allegedly neutral effort to root out unspeak is that Greens and other kinds of radical thinkers will be hobbled by the kind of return to the safety zone of rationality and policy wonkery that the left has traditionally exhibited, and which is exactly where the left has lost in recent decades to the likes of Frank Luntz and so on. And my view against what Stephen recommends is that we should listen to George Lakoff and Drew Weston and George Marcus and others who want to say that actually reasoning is necessarily metaphorical and emotional and evaluative. Let me give a few examples. Friends of the Earth is one of the examples that Stephen gives. I don't think it's true to say that this term brainwashes. Does anybody really think that the term is supposed to mean that if you don't support the Friends of the Earth, then you are an enemy of the Earth, and you are someone who hates the Earth? I don't think so. It seems to me that the term was actually probably brought in, and I know some of the people who were around at the time the Friends of the Earth was created, in a kind of creative, positive, almost ironic spirit. Something along these following lines. The Earth has no friends. It's not capable of having any friends. That's why it needs friends. That's why it needs people who are going to act as if they are its friends. Does anybody get confused by the term Friends of the Earth into thinking that people think that they can, for example, call up the Earth and ask it to go for coffee or something? I think not. Women against rape is an interesting one. People say, well, Women Against Rape, that's a ludicrous name for an organisation because it implies that anyone who doesn't support it is in favour of rape. It implies that the only alternative is an organisation called something like Men for Rape. But it seems to me that actually the rhetorical point of a name such as Women Against Rape is to suggest that actually there are quite a lot of features of our current society which actually normalise attitudes which lead to rape. And you actually need to make absolutely explicit, we are against rape, and that is going to mean an overcoming of those normalisations. What about the term refugee, which Stephen discusses in a very interesting way in this book? He points out correctly, the term asylum seeker has gradually replaced the term refugee, shifting the emphasis from what a person was fleeing to the demands he was making on the country he arrived in. So the term asylum seeker is a way of making us less sympathetic to the people called refugees. Well, George Lakoff came up, Stephen gave us a couple of examples of where George Lakoff perhaps didn't do the best job he possibly could have done in relation to political discourse, but it seems to me that a lot of the things that Lakoff has said actually do make a lot of sense. Here's one example. Lakoff has said, look, people are talking now about asylum seekers, and they're talking on a large scale about economic migrants. But this term economic migrant is prejudicial. In many cases, a better description, a truer name, would be economic refugee. So I guess my question to Stephen on this would be, well, is the term economic refugee unspeak or not? It seems to me that actually it would be a really good thing for us to introduce into public discourse a term like economic refugee and try to make it replace a term like economic migrant. And if that's going to be called Unspeak, then either so much the worse for the calling of things Unspeak, or we could endorse the conclusion that maybe some Unspeak is good. At the end of his book, Stephen explicitly addresses the question of Lakoff's alternative to Unspeak, which Stephen calls fighting Unspeak with Unspeak. Lakoff calls it reframing. And Stephen suggests, look, isn't it better than replacing war speak by peace speak to, quote, simply judiciously use normal language, allowing for fine-grained selection and discrimination for urbanity and finesse, unquote. Well, and that's all fine. I'm all in favour of discrimination and urbanity and finesse. But I think also that we should be ready to speak a lot more creatively, and indeed to create something like peace speak as an alternative to war speak. And one interesting example would be in relation to what we were discussing briefly during the question and answer session, the interesting topic of climate change. So Stephen addresses this brilliantly originally in the early part of the book. And he quotes Jeremy Leggett, one of the key peak oil theorists. Leggett says this: "I have never considered global warming a scary enough term. If I could have designed a language, I'd have gone for global overheating, climate chaos, or maybe climate meltdown." And it seems to me that actually those terms are potentially extremely helpful. And they are something like truer names. So again, the question arises, well, is climate meltdown Unspeak? And if it is, then I want to say, well, some Unspeak is good. It seems to me that there is nothing wrong, necessarily, with persuasive definition, with persuasive use of language involving emotive terms, where emotivity is called for. There's nothing wrong with reframing that is open. And this is one of the crucial differences between Lakoff and Luntz. Right? Luntz wrote his manuals and sold them to people and required that those people did not reveal them in public, because Luntz was essentially trying to manipulate people. Whereas Lakoff went out from the beginning and said, here is the way I suggest that we should speak for. It wasn't an attempt to manipulate people behind the scenes. It was, as it were, saying, I suggest you speak this way. Now, you can listen to me making that suggestion, and I'm not trying to pull the wool over your eyes. So I think there's nothing wrong with reframing that is open, as Lakoff's has been, that is based on truth. So, for example, Nicaragua was never a dagger pointing at the heart of America. But man-made climate change is the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. And that is appropriately creative. So to say it again, my concern is that the definition of Unspeak that we have on the board here is too expansive. That it potentially rules out, for example, the flights of rhetoric, not just of Osama bin Laden and George Bush, but of Obama or Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King and Obama surely persuade by stealth some of the time, as one is carried along by the beauty and emotionality of their language. I think really one of the things we're in here is the old debate between philosophy and poetry, or between philosophy and rhetoric. And in this debate, Stephen seems to take Plato's side when he takes Confucius's side. Plato, of course, again, a person who famously denounced metaphor and imaginative use of language and poetry and rhetoric, and abolished these people in the sense of saying that they should be outside the ideal city, and did so precisely by using wonderfully imaginative language. But that's, as it were, almost an aside. It seems to me that philosophy at its best is inevitably poetic, and that politics is inevitably rhetorical. And we have to embrace this rather than trying to minimize it or get away from it. So where it looks to me as though Stephen and I most disagree is on solutions, based on our apparent disagreement about how avoidable and undesirable Unspeak on his definition is. I think we do have to use reframing language, peace speak if you like to replace war speak, green speak to replace grey speak. I would like Stephen to be more of an assistant to Lakoff and Weston, and for that matter me, and less of an opponent. Are we not to speak of the earth as our home? Are we not to speak of the earth as our mother? What I'm trying to do at the moment, what I'm trying to write at the moment, is a British and more radical, more green version of the Lakoff and Weston project, which takes the kind of thing that Stephen is trying to do, but takes it further and doesn't shy away from the inevitable conclusion or presupposition that one is making here an intervention and is not attempting to be neutral. So, for example, Stephen has a wonderful critique of the concept of natural resources. But I think we should go even further. It seems to me that the very term environment is a disastrous term, because the term environment gives us the idea that we are environment, that it's something other than us. We need to replace the term environment with terms such as ecosystem. The idea of throwing things away is essentially absurd. Away where? There is no away. The idea of disposable products, the idea of a commodity. How can there be such a thing as a commodity, given that land and labour from which commodities are entirely made are themselves not commodities? John Ruskin said, the only wealth is life. The only true wealth is life. And that seems to me true. We have to completely revision our concept of wealth. What this is about is a whole way of seeing and a way of taking the world, a new world picture, if you like. As Wittgenstein remarked, we have to plough over the whole of our language. Ways of taking the world also help make that world. If you look upon the world more as cooperative and holistic, it becomes more so. If you look upon the world more as competitive, as inherently divided, it becomes more so. If you look upon the world as a spectator looking upon it from outside it, it becomes more so. The very idea of neutrality with regards to what and where we are and to what we are describing is a dangerous gesture of othering. In other words, the very idea of trying to be relatively neutral involves taking to some degree a spectatorial stance and distancing ourselves from the world and from other people. Shouldn't we take the world in a way which makes it more likely to be that way? I suggest we have no alternative. We are not spectators mutually describing. As you describe it, so it shall be. For citizens of the world, lexical neutrality is a fantasy, and moreover, a dangerous one.
Respond to them?
Yeah, a few points that I jotted down as they came up. I'd like to say that I don't by any means want to abolish metaphor. I like metaphors. They're a great thing. As you pointed out, I use them, those ones ironically in that passage, because I basically talk about weapon metaphors and so forth. And, you know, I studied literature, I like fragments, and so metaphors are great. I think I got the impression sometimes that what you were doing there, you were slipping from a concept of Unspeak to saying that I was trying to outlaw rhetoric more generally, which I don't believe I'm doing. Certainly, I mean, you can make a rhetorical case without ever using what I would call Unspeak. So Unspeak is not, if you like, Unspeak is a subset of rhetorical procedure. And I'm not saying for a moment that we could ban all rhetoric, still let's ban all metaphor.
What about the climate meltdown? Is that supposed to be Unspeak?
Well, the thing about, you know, I noted this down, it's interesting. I'm also not saying that we have to be emotionless. I think you can talk emotionally, again, without using what I'm defining as Unspeak. But my problem, and you said before, you mentioned climate meltdown, you said maybe some of our environmental talk should be a cry of pain and disbelief. And that's, I think, what climate meltdown is. It's kind of, you know, listen to this is really important. And my objection to that, I suppose, is a pragmatic one, in that you are less likely to persuade your opponents if they can say, oh, you're just emotionally exaggerating the situation. So you're less likely to succeed in a reasonable debate if you succeed at first in having a reasonable debate in the first place, if you see what I mean. So that would be my worry about using phrases like climate meltdown in order to counter climate change and so forth, or global heating, as James Lovelock, I think, currently calls it. I think that's one of the better ones, actually. Global heating. Well, okay, that's just what's happening. It doesn't bring in a theory about a moral attitude to what's going on. It just says the globe is heating up.
I've heard of use the term global overheat.
Overheat, well, I mean, you know, overheat from whose perspective? It's an overheat from our perspective,
From
sure.
us, yeah.
I like your point about Friends of the Earth. I can see that nobody is confused about Friends of the Earth, and so that's maybe a silly example. And I was interested by your example of economic refugee versus economic migrant, which I hadn't really thought about before, so I'll have to think about it some more. The thing is, if you call, I suppose I'd want to know more about the particular cases that you want to apply the term economic refugee to before I decide whether or not I think it's unspeak.
Yeah, I think with economic refugee, the idea is supposed to be not that you can apply that to every single person who might have previously been called economic migrant, but that it will apply to an awful lot. That it will apply, for example, to pretty much anybody who's been displaced by processes of globalization and free trade and so on and so forth, which have affected the third world disproportionately and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't want to call the American city banker in London an economic refugee.
No, of course not.
It is
No.
an economic migrant.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Again, on this kind of how does Frank Williams or Karl Rove operate versus how does George Lakoff operate? What Luntz and Rove mostly do is a kind of targeted political marketing along the lines of what you were talking about. But you see, I think there's something interestingly different in what Lakoff is trying to do and what I'm trying to do, if you like, following Lakoff, which involves a kind of leadership. I might have used the phrase transformational leadership if it hadn't been undone so abruptly earlier. The idea that Lakoff is trying to put forward is it's not just a question of kind of appealing to people where they already are. It's not even just a question, although this is very important, of kind of mobilizing their better angels and mobilizing their values in a better direction. It's also a question of leading people into new ways of thinking, which may be essential for us and may go against apparently superficially neutral ways of speaking that currently exist. For example, it's kind of common sense. It's a kind of inherited common sense that we have in our culture at the present time, and I think Stephen would agree with this, that economic growth is desirable and also that it makes sense. So, I want to ask questions like, well, economic growth into what? And growth indefinitely? And is growth always maturation or not? And then more deeper questions such as, well, why? Why economic growth? Why is this necessarily a good thing? And then some of the ways that you can start to create a kind of genuine reframing is by saying things like, look, the economy is not the fundamental thing. It's not the economy stupid. If you look at the Earth, it's our life support system stupid. And unless we take care of it, unless we, as it were, befriend it, there isn't going to be any economy. And the problem with endless economic growth is that it ruptures the limits of that ecosystem. So this is a kind of revolution in economics and in political rhetoric that I want to suggest that we need to lead and to be a part of.
What you've just done there is very well unpacked this notion of economic growth without replacing it with any unspeak that I can do. So I fully agree.
Well, that's great.
You also managed to squeeze in the practical progress.
Well, but what if, for example, as a kind of creative and shorthand version of that, because it's quite tough to understand all of that for a lay audience. Well, for an average voter.
It was ordinary neutral language. Why can't average voters understand that? I think you're being condescending to them if you assume they can't, and that you have to give them a slogan instead.
I don't know. My experience has been that it's it's quite tough to get understood by original. What about if I were to say, if as a shorthand for that, I were to say, look, the Earth is our mother. I mean, is that Unspeak?
No, I think it's a metaphor.
Okay, well that's good. Maybe we don't disagree on that. Cool.
Jeremy.
The struggle we're having here seems to be to isolate that bit of rhetorical or emotive language that is unspeak. There's something wrong with it, it's bad, we shouldn't do it. And surely the answer to that is that it's bad where it's pretending to be or substituting for a proper argument. It's not bad when you've produced a good argument, you've got a sound case, and then you're kind of going into a rhetorical flourish, trying to add the spice and get people worked up. That's fine. But if it's supposed to be, if you're putting it forward as if it's an argument, when it's just not a good argument, then that's the problem. So let me give you an example on the climate change or climate meltdown case. Now, climate meltdown might be a perfectly good way of encapsulating your views about what the future climate's going to be like. But suppose you went through an argument like this. We're facing climate meltdown, therefore, any amount of spending on current, carbon reduction programs is worth it. Well, that's a bad argument, because now you're just going, meltdown, what does meltdown mean? Meltdown, how bad are things going to be? How much is it worth spending now to avoid that? You have to get into a serious argument about that. And meltdown isn't good enough to conduct that argument. But a lot of people do use arguments like that. They go, look, we're facing a catastrophe, it's a climatic catastrophe, we're going to do anything possible now to stop it. So that's a bad argument, using smuggled in language, using unspeak. So I'm offering a general theory, even if you don't know that example. I think my general account of when rhetorical language is unspeak is when it's passing itself off as an argument.
What is the part played in our discourse of those things that are not evidence-based and are not facts? For instance, regarding climate change, what is the part played in our thinking about that by the people who deny that there's a problem, and who do so by deploying a great many rhetorical tricks and obfuscation? What is the part played in our ability to teach our students by that kind of work? And I take you to be at least tolerating us turning our back on it, and I think it's probably a crucial part of our work. I'm reminded of Coyote and the Navajo Coyote making a case for the existence of death. That if we don't have death, then we won't know what to appreciate.
Yeah, good. Okay, I get it now. And I think I agree. I think we don't disagree. I think that there is an enormous amount that can be learned from that. You do some of this, don't you, Phil? In your teaching, you look at examples of these kind of bad arguments given by climate deniers. So I don't tend to do it very much in my own teaching, but I easily could. And I think, for example, you can learn an enormous amount about, roughly speaking, human psychology by the way in which you can determine how people are attracted by these arguments, as it were, sort of no matter what. And this links in, I think, with various Wittgensteinian ideas around, for example, as I mentioned before, that philosophical problems being fundamentally problems of the will and not the intellect, and so on. I think we can get a very clear picture of that from the ways in which and the degree to which people are attracted by climate denial. So perhaps we don't disagree. I haven't entirely understood why you thought we did, but anyway.
Just to comment about climate, the thing that's interesting about climate denial as a phenomenon is that there's no argument there. They don't even pretend to produce arguments. They take on the methods of the tobacco one, that were founded by Bernays. It's all about spoiling the arguments of the opposition. So what they do is they plant seeds of doubt in the populace's mind about the certainty with which people who are doing climate science know what's going on. So it's not like they produce counter arguments to climate science or anything like about what we do is to just release lots of press releases saying scientists are, there's no consensus on this.
On the other hand, and this maybe plugs into what John's saying, it's interesting that one of the quickest, if you know nothing about climate science, one of the quickest ways to start getting a grasp on it is you go to the BBC website where it refutes common sceptical arguments. And so if those sceptical so-called arguments didn't exist, somebody wouldn't have done that page refuting them and pointing you to all the evidence, which is actually an excellent resource for teaching myself what the truth is.
I think that's absolutely right. I saw a very interesting piece recently where someone was taking apart this term climate skeptic, which of course is a very prejudicial term, because there's a certain sense in which the scientific method is inherently skeptical, and this is a good thing, and so on. So it's an attempt to make themselves look scientific. This author recommended that an appropriate kind of critical term to use for climate deniers, that the best term to use was doubt addicts. I wonder what you think of that, Stephen. Is that Unspeak? It seems to me it's actually a great term, and really captures it. It's the sense in which people are, it's the sense in which that these people are kind of dogmatically kind of insisting upon a certain kind of thing, where that kind of insistence is precisely not warranted.
You know, of course it is Unspeak because you're pathologizing it, you're medicalizing it, you're calling them addicts, and you want that nasty association with drug addicts and so forth. So it's.
Okay, well,
you're not going to make any friends on the so-called skeptic by using that label.
I appreciate that, but it seems to me that is an example, if it is Unspeak, where we might want to say, well, sometimes Unspeak is quite legitimate and a good thing in political debate.
I am worried that you're going to get an MTD from Lakoff. That's a metaphorically transmitted disease. Lakoff doesn't have your problem because Lakoff thinks everything is a metaphor except something that is strictly, this is to the left of that, this is on top of that. So real, reason, those are all metaphors for him. So the problem that you have is that you want to say some kinds of Unspeak are good if they're designed for admirable political aims. Where the other kinds, they both will seal off discourse, but the discourse that's sealed off by the Unspeak that's bad is bad. The discourse I want to seal off is good. I put that wrong. My aim in sealing it off is good. Now, it seems to me that the criticism that you're making of Stephen, whose basic objective is to keep the discussion open. I think you said that. That if you want to argue, no, I want to keep the discussion closed about things I don't like, then you have what I call an MTD.
Well, I don't think that's a fair account. I don't want to close down the discussion. As I say, one of the things that's good about Lakoff is precisely that he allows the discussion of these things to be open. I think it is absolutely inevitable and unavoidable, as Lakoff and many others have said, that we are thoroughly metaphorical, etc., and rhetorical in so much of our discourse and communication, and it would be a dismally kind of reduced life world if we tried to make it otherwise. So, my suggestion is let's openly engage in this process in a way that is, as I said, roughly speaking, evidence-based, and takes the world in the way that the world actually is, and the way that it actually should be. That we actually speak in a way that as it were, reflects the way that we inhabit the world and are with each other and so on and so forth, and don't try to pretend that our deepest values and goals and so on are something that are somehow sort of superadded to a world which can be neutrally described before them. You know, this is getting involved here in quite kind of deep issues in ethics and social philosophy and so on and so forth. One way of putting what I'm trying to say there, it would be something like that. To take the idea of roughly Lakoffian reframing seriously is to take seriously the kind of idea that people like pragmatists and Wittgensteinians have insisted on for a long time, that it's a total mistake to think that there's any kind of neutral standpoint from which one can describe one's involvement in the world and with other people and so on and so forth.
And I wanted to ask Rupert actually, what's actually involved in your saying that you want to do this reframing and come up with new bits of Unspeak to counter the old, but you're going to do it openly? I mean, it sounds to me like you want to have your cake and eat it too. So you want to get the kind of stealthy persuasion of the Unspeak, but you want to say, hey, we're doing this openly, so we're not really persuading anyone stealthily, you know, we're doing it honestly and directly. I mean, you mentioned you don't have time to explain it, or if you explain the thing about growth to your constituents in the way you did just then, they don't really understand you, so you want to say something else. So if you don't say what you just said, in what way are you reframing it openly? Are you just writing an article about it somewhere that people are expected to go and look up if they want to know what you think, or how? What is this open reframing actually consist of?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, the answer to some extent is the article is available if you want to go read it. Whereas with Luntz, people had to actually expose this stuff and leak it and so on and so forth. And you can read it if you go to my blog, which is on the handout, where you can find this stuff. It took a lot of finding. But it's not just that. It's also, well, let's say this. It seems to me that concision is often a virtue and is often unavoidable. What I'm inclined to say is something like, I'll be as kind of open and back up as much as possible as the situation allows, as the context allows. And a lot of the time, you know, you only have 10 seconds, or you only have a minute, or you have an audience which doesn't understand very much of what you want to talk about, and so on and so forth, and you've got to work within those constraints. I mean, in terms of the question that you raised about, well, isn't it better to stick with ordinary language? Well, as I said, it seems to me that the question that we need to ask is, well, what is ordinary and what is everyday around here, and how does that constrain us? We better not be constrained by those ideas in the sense of being a kind of conservative kind of constraint. It seems to me, for example, that it's perfectly ordinary everyday response to certain things to be completely outraged by them and to just say, you know, this is appalling and we've got to do everything we can to stop climate meltdown, or, you know, not we've got to sacrifice the entire economy, but...
I just wanted to ask about conservatism, because several times you've said, rather with something but that would be conservatism. But maybe you want to unpack your own use of that word, since you're a Green Party candidate, and presumably you think there are a lot of things that are worth conserving.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, whenever I'm talking to Conservative voters on the doorstep, I say, oh great, so presumably you're someone who believes in conserving things. And then I try to say, so, well actually we believe in conserving things, whereas of course the Conservative Party believes in, you know, bulldozing everything and making it into motorways and so on. But yeah, what I was meaning to index by the term conservatism in this context wasn't obviously the Conservative Party and its ideology as such.
But even small c conservatism, you know, it's you can't just use it as a boo word, because presumably you think there are things worth conserving. So I wasn't quite sure how you're actually using conservatism in this discussion.
The way I'm using it is the idea that the philosophy that how things are is in principle a reason for preserving them that way. Not in relation to specifics, but in general. Now that, I think, is a dangerous ideology and philosophy, insofar as it encourages us to think that the status quo is more or less fundamentally on the right track, when, as you yourself have said, there may be important ways in which Unspeak language encourages us to think that, but it's actually not true. So that's, yeah.
Okay, that was great. Thank you.